of that is not remaining here. It needs to remain here to create jobs here. ADB, we've done our part, we'll continue to do our part, but we need, by the way, I shouldn't leave out, I talked about AU, no, private sector. Private sector are a major part of this equation because at the end of the day, private sector are major employers anywhere in the world, including our continent. So let's not formulate policies from the public sector in isolation from consulting the captains of industry, who at the end of the day have to absorb this youth. So let me stop there, Chair, because as you can see, I probably can go on and on forever, but let me stop here as a basis then to set the ground for our discussions here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we should give him a round of applause. I think so. I was just listening in. I was happy for you to continue.
Thank you.
Maybe
Thank you.
it would not have been fair to the others. Well, that's quite an opening. I think it's frank and it's direct and very refreshing. Thank you very much, sir. So advisory services come from outside, you say, and also even the parts that we then get to use from whatever we might be using is also from outside. And let's not view this whole thing as just a project. This is a big industry. And then we need that chain, value-added chain. And also let's do mapping on exactly where are the jobs, where are the deficiencies, and then how then do we get those young people into the job market. The issue that I think is very important also is that which you raised is the issue of local content laws, but laws that are actually effective, you say. Otherwise, they will just collect dust and as you say, we can't also say use local content when we actually don't know ourselves what that local content is. Barbara, I saw you smiling and nodding. Yeah? So were you in agreement or in disagreement? Some people say no whilst they're doing this.
This is yes, and more yes.
So your response, you concur?
Yes, but before I comment specifically on those points, I want to make a global statement. It's incredibly wonderful.
I hope it's short because...
oh, okay.
Yeah.
I
No, I
thought you
hope
were
it's short.
telling me.
I'm not saying don't. Global scares me.
Oh, okay. But picking up on what Dr. Mayaki said this morning, this imperative of becoming operational is critical and leaving skepticism behind. And I think between the Job Creation Toolkit, which is being developed along with project preparation and SDN, and the 5% agenda, mobilizing local African institutional investment, dealing with the logistical issues, Move Africa, you have a constellation of best practice-based instruments that will be the spear that you talked about. So, do you want me now to talk about the Job Creation Toolkit?
Yes.
Okay. So, as mentioned this morning, there is in the act of development the PIDA Job Creation Toolkit. Now, why is this important? I think Shem put forward the basis incredibly important. Right? Each PIDA project creates not just direct jobs, but indirect jobs from suppliers, induced jobs from the income spent from the direct and indirect jobs, and as well secondary, especially in Africa where you have so many pent-up demands. As Dr. Mayaki said, with energy, you are changing the landscape of the whole economy. So you bring in energy, you bring in transport, ICT. These are secondary economic spillover effects. And the way that the studies and the TORs are normally put there, first of all, we do not capture that systematically in our assessment of development impact. So at a time when we all believe that job creation is fundamental, if we look at the PIDA project documentation, the feasibility studies, the environmental, social, and impact studies, they do not, in fact, capture the incredibly large development impact of job creation associated with those very same PIDA projects. So what we are now doing is creating a best practice toolkit based on African economic data to create national input-output tables. When you measure job estimates, whether it's in Europe, the US, you use national input-output tables, but Africa governments do not have them. So we're putting those together. And so you can have, for example, Patoka Gorge. Based on preliminary estimates, we have put through the inputs on the project. And the output is, based on those assumptions, 2 million job years over the useful life of the project. It is huge. Why is this important? It is important because, one, you can do, as Shem indicated, you can think very systematically about, do I import, for example, there is another project in that area of the world where they imported steel, cement, as well as the professional services. There is a huge difference in the impact on the economy if you're not doing local sourcing of materials, equipment, services, and labor. So project owners will be equipped for their own knowledge as well as bargaining power to be able to say to potential contractors, investors, and even to each other, and looking at the import, how do we maximize African jobs? They can also work with other parts of the government and development partners in training and think through, how do we take our young engineers that are now unemployed and they can work on, so the mapping you spoke about, we can use this as a basis to think about how to go forward. In the case, again, of Patoka Gorge, when we did 2 scenarios and said, what if there was more local sourcing, there was a difference of 7,000 annual jobs for Zambia and Zimbabwe. These are real items to think about for policymakers to use in deciding how they're going to source, and also what are the interventions that are needed to be able to train and make sure there is an alignment between the demands for jobs and the provision to Africans. Also, the procurement terms. For example, there can be local content requirements, but there also can be training requirements there. So there are real instruments that could be put together, and especially with the support of the AU, there could be, this morning in the talk about model, PIDA model laws and regulations, this could be integrated into that. And finally, on industrial policy, this is a way to think through, if these projects require, for example, a lot of steel or other materials, or you can have an alignment between where you invest in different activities to really build up the supply of equipment and materials to projects, and that, of course, is fundamental to regional integration, creating economies of scale that are fundamental to job creation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see, Clyde, you nodding. You were in agreement. But there's a question, and you can go further on what you want to react to. I hear Barbara saying this is important, and studies show that we can create about 2 million jobs, and we talk about local sourcing. How much, maybe it might not have been your experience if you were working at a country level, but how much in these institutions that also depend on partnership funding, that your hands are really free to decide where you source?
I'm not necessarily too sure about that, though. But I can tell you, if I may, that labor and materials has always been a challenge. And my biting point has been, we talk about steel, we talk about all the other sourcing materials, but those are raw materials. Those are raw materials that we mine in Africa and then export it. And I think what we're touching on is necessarily what is the beneficiation of that? And can we produce in Zambia from the copper that we mine and send off to China, can we use that for piping, for plumbing and so forth? That's important to us. That I see as job creation, and our colleague touched on operations and manufacturing. That's where the money is. It's no use taking our raw materials and exporting it and then buying it back as an end product. We need to create that beneficiation. I think Dangote is probably a good example. However, I also see that as an input, just a minor input into that, like bricks and so forth. So I'm talking about the larger equipment, the big steel equipment, that needs to be put into that. And organizations such as banks and other organizations should participate, if that is answering your question, into that to ensure that the data that we're collecting about what is happening and how we fund and source those local manufacturers and inputs work. Similarly with labor, I think. We need to look at that. I can use myself as an example. I started off as an engineer. But because it's local and your international guys come in and they seem to be far better than you become slightly more disillusioned. And I find myself in a bank. But I haven't steered too far away from infrastructure because it's at your heart. And that's where you want to participate. So even as a bank, we want to be involved, and I'm sure my colleague here at DBSA will tell you the same thing, is we want to participate from that particular point of view and ensure that we grow and move this forward. I hope I've answered that in a certain way.
I hope so, but I want to go to Baba because I think this is important. Organizations like the NEPA agency, SADC, AU, who depend mainly on funding that comes from outside, from partners. They're no longer donors these days, they're partners, right? How much of free hand do they have in deciding where they source? Is that a problem, do you think, or we are past that? That's what I really want to understand.
The key thing for getting investment in infrastructure is very simple. Cash flow. We talked about it, Moya, you talked about it this morning. You look at a project, is it bankable? I am indifferent as to the sourcing as long as I have complete, based on my due diligence, I have complete confidence that there is an off-taker who's providing reliable, timely, complete payment for the services that then without political interference or economic disruption is going to be used to provide me with the debt service or the expected equity return. So the critical trade-off, I think, is being able to reconcile the classical problem, and local content is an issue we've debated for decades, is can we be sure if we move to greater local sourcing, both of labor as well as equipment, do you have the quality and do you have the timeliness in those inputs to make sure there's no risk to your, or delay to your cash flows and your returns? So, and that's really important. I go back to Dr. Mayaki's metaphor, hunting. We need to hunt together. When you put together any kind of infrastructure project, it is a mega process. Your DNA, to get that deal across the finish line, you need to have highly experienced professional project finance people, sector experts, working with mega political support to be able to get it done. Sure. So that's what we got to do as a team.
Sure. So, you guys have actually tried to set up something, the competitive supplier development program. Talk to us about that. Talk to us about that. Yeah, I'd really asked for the radio. This one is.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for this. Can you hear me?
I think so.
Yes. Okay. I actually work for Transnet pays me during the day when I'm not here being an African child. And in terms of just the regulatory environment, because I was a lawyer one day, and that is one key element that drives either a success or a failure of an investment. And because Transnet is state-owned, 100%, it has a responsibility from the Shareholders' Compact of providing logistics services solutions for the country to drive the economic growth, to lower the cost of doing business, to job create in a sustainable fashion. So because of that, every investment that comes to the country for that logistics, which is ports, rail, pipeline, at a point in time there was an airline in the mix, has to self-fund. So unlike the story of the sovereign funding long-term infrastructure, Transnet funds it from the balance sheet, like any JSE listed company which is not listed. But the idea that we actually have to build a 200-kilometer rail line and then have a commercial value tomorrow is a pipe dream. It doesn't happen. Rail infrastructure, port infrastructure is a key driver for any economy, and for our continent, certainly that. And those who were with me at PIDA when we started, I used to say, it's a cancer of lack of maintenance. Because not only do you invest in it, the very next day, as you put down that rail line, you must maintain it. So the capital behind it is so big that it will not be commercially viable any day. With due respect to my banking brothers, thank God I was a banker too, in project finance. So as a continent, we need to have an understanding of the economic drive and then the commercial that comes out of it. It will come 20 years later, it's not going to come tomorrow. So as we were developing what we call the MDS, which was a market demand strategy, as Transnet, we had been suffering from the same cancer I was talking about, of lack of maintenance on the rolling stock, on the railway lines themselves. So we took a view that we need to have a scalable project, one whereby we look at a commercial value that will sustain the railway and the port facility. So we have an entire logistics. So it's not just the port and rail, it's also the intermodal logistics side, the short haul. So all of that needed us to sit with industry. So when we were talking about the coal line, for instance, or the iron ore line, and the iron ore line, I'll tell you about it because it's unprecedentedly one of the best in the world. It runs the longest train in the world, 453 wagons of heavy haul, a system that is very much, it works because it pays for itself. Because you've got the industry, which is the iron ore industry, people, the mining companies. They've got a market in China. We have a rail that works. We have sidings that work. We have loading facilities that work. So we have a system that operationally really functions. How did we fund that and how did we create the jobs is what you were asking me. When I joined, at the time, I used to work for railway, freight rail. There were no women around the railway. There was not even a loo for women around the railway. So that was just a man's job, and they were mainly white. And we came in with a strategy that was enforced by the post-1994 of South Africa, whereby we had to create the skills. We couldn't be told there aren't any. We said, fine, there are not any. We need to create them. So up front, you need to know what you have. That's the first thing. You need to diagnose the industry. If it's a project, then I'll take a project. If it's a project, you look at the project itself and what are the key milestones and deliverables of that project. And then do an internal scanning. What do you have? Okay, we have these little engineers. They are qualified, but none of them have actually done this big work. So you go to your big guy and you say, listen here, Mr. Forster, chief engineer. Now what you're going to do for me is you're going to train these 5 youngsters. You have to hire them with no skill. You cannot wait for them to have a skill. They're not going to have that skill. So we brought kids from school. We had a deliberate effort. We brought women. We brought youngsters. So they were both male and female, but mainly, I'm a lady, so I'm allowed to say this, mainly linked to bring in girl children who are engineers. We bring youth. We bring people with a disability. And you say to each of your people in the organization, your job is simple. You're going to train this guy because you're not their person. this is an organization and this is a country. So in essence, we went into that. Now this is just formal skills, right? So you had to train them on that formal sector, deliberate effort. Then you place them in the various areas, because remember this, you also will find they are in Joburg, they're in Cape Town, but no, there are kids who are also coming from Hotazel, from some dark rural place. So we look for those, deliberate effort, and place them in the right place, because also you need the social infrastructure to play a role. Because otherwise you're going to have this urban sprawl of all of these children who went to private schools. That includes me, by the way, but anyway. You know, you're going to have that, and it's going to be skewed. So that deliberate effort of, so we went through a session of looking at the entire organization, what do we have? All our operations, what do we need? And then training. And then we actually went out to find the best practice. You know, Canadian Pacific. We went to, for the port side, we went to Rotterdam, the big guys, and said, how do you train your people? What can we do together? And they collaborated with us. There is a lot of collaboration that can happen if you put the effort behind it and the will behind it. I'm not going to lie, there was resistance big time, but we pushed through it. Yeah. From basically, you know, the entire South African was in an uproar, and South Africans will know this. Oh, why are you training only blacks? Why are whites being sidelined? They were not being sidelined. There was a deliberate effort of skills. The majority of the people there were black children who couldn't get an opportunity because of a technicality. You need experience before you can be hired. Where are they supposed to get the experience from? As a continent, and in PIDA itself, and specifically in the high-speed rail, we've got a deliberate effort of creating pools of skills. So training is core behind it. And you're not going to train the day that you need the project. Up front, as you sit and you conceptualize it, you also do that first phrase. You do that first phrase of looking for what skills you're going to need, what markets you're going to create, what entrepreneurs you're going to need, and all those become pillars of part of your project. So while you're looking for a Barbara who can, you know, do your project finance, or the hot-notch lawyers who are looking at your regulatory framework, those social issues that sit at that belt need to be dealt with. So that's what we did. However, the problems. I'm going to give you one other example. This example was on locomotives. So we were procuring the largest bit of locomotives in the entire world, the entire Africa has seen in a long time. Of course, our OEMs all came from somewhere else other than South Africa, because there's none there. But from a Transnet perspective, we have a company called TE, which is rail engineering, where there's been years and years of experience, because, you know, we had rolling stock, and these guys learned so much. They're so smart, and they would know how to cannibalize this one, to fix this one, to keep it working, whatever the story was. So generally, a skill developed inside that space. So we decided, no, we've got to learn more. We cannot just be procuring all the time like that. So the local content story came into being. You are going to need so much local content, and that came into our tender document up front. So a guy tendered, they knew that this was supposed to happen. Practically, big problems. Because if you're not ready, we were not, and you didn't have that steel that you're talking about, and they would quote a part which only comes from China at that point in time. So again, we had, okay, lessons learned. We need to do something differently. It's a learning curve, and I think Dr. Moyaki put it nicely so. That it's a learning curve, but what we need to do is share this information. You cannot have each party making the same mistake. And when it's a PIDA project, for instance, we're doing one with Swaziland and Mozambique, a missing link, a railway line, we're doing it together. We are all using the same people from all three countries. We're growing the skills from all three countries. We have a commonality of understanding what this operation will need. We are even having partners, African Development Bank and IDC, that are coming in to help us to project prepare it until we get to the last end. But all the social issues are key. One of them is the community liaison. Communities where you build this infrastructure have to benefit, so you've got to go into them as well. Not only your organization, but the communities, because that's where you're going to get the entrepreneurs, and that's where you're going to create jobs. Can I end there for now?
For now, you may end.
Sure. Yeah.
We'll come back to you if you want to. Appreciate it. Emmanuel Hannibal, you were nodding softly there, and you seem to have had success factors. I'm really sorry, this mic is giving me a headache. You seem to have had success factors, lessons learned in negotiating about what? 30% locally sourced raw materials for the construction of Walvis Bay container terminal. Talk to us about the challenges, maybe, and also the successes of that.
Can you hear me? Okay. Now, I represent the Namibian Ports Authority. Yes, we started off our project a few years ago. The project value that we have for the project is about 4 billion Namibian dollars or so. We were funded by African Development Bank. 80% of the funding is from African Development Bank, about 2.8 billion. The other 20% is source or is own funding from the balance sheet of NAMPORT, as well as contribution from the shareholder, which is the government, 10%, 10%. Now, in terms of ensuring that 30% of goods and services are sourced from local, we had then to make it part of the tender requirements. Tender requirements that if you don't meet that requirement in your submission, so then you were not considered any further. So it was one of the duties of the tenderers to ensure that they also do a study to be able to see what are those materials that can be sourced locally. We had already done that ourselves, so we could provide guidance. So what is important is that in your contracting, you make sure that the structures and conditions that you put for the supply, for the contractor is really what you want to achieve. But what we have further done is we have split the whole works, and we have said the main contractor's task is only to provide the civil infrastructure, which include the reclamation of land, piling works, and then the main SDSs, the rest of the equipment and other works will be sourced locally. So therefore only 3.3 billion of the contract was then awarded to the main contractor, and the other parts like the internal roads, the automation works, and all of that, those are separate contracts that we are issuing directly ourselves. With that, what we do is that we then ensure, because we know that locals can provide those services, so those services will then be contracted using our own tender requirements locally. So that process is still ongoing where we are sourcing that. Mm-hmm. In terms of the audit process, we have appointed an independent body to continuously, on periodic basis, look at whether the contractor is meeting the terms and conditions, because there are penalties if indeed the contractor does not meet the local requirements. And because of that, we now see that we are above the 30% threshold. So when it comes to the issue of local content, we have two levels. One is the level of ownership. Second is the content level in terms of people that you employ and the goods and services that you can source locally. To date, within the project, we have employed, or the project has employed directly 800 local Namibians, and then additional 150 is indirect employment that we have. So in terms of the challenges, basically because we have done a lot of preparatory work upfront in terms of studies that were done, the master plan that we were assisted by JICA, and the other additional studies, the market study, because when we wanted to go to the market, European investment came through and said, look, maybe your market study is too thin. So we did additional market study to be able to confirm whether the traffic flows that has been indicated, to confirm the cash flows are adequate. And indeed, that also came through strongly. And only after we have done that did we then went out and sourced the financier. Normally, the financiers also have their own procurement rules. But what we have done is we have spoken to African Development Bank to allow us to use our own procurement rules. But during this process of us using our rules, we would have to constantly engage them so that we can align them to their practices in terms of how they are doing and their requirements. So it has really helped us to work closely with the financier. But then one of the challenges that you continuously have is the balance between the procurement rules of your financier, because they have different procurement rules than ours. And also, further, what you then have is the challenges of your own local procurement laws. But that we have mitigated through constant engagement between ourselves as the Ports Authority, the government as the shareholder, and the one that wants to see us meeting the or having compliance of the national laws, and then the African Development Bank. So that has really helped us to be able to close the gaps between ourselves, the bank, and then government as the shareholder, whilst also meeting the interest of the local entrepreneurs that have that interest to constantly participate in projects of this nature. We have also, as part of this process...
I'll just I want to cover everybody.
I was excited, you know, when Thank you.
But I'm sorry, we're not mentioning names here. Mohan Vivekanandan, who is Group Executive Origination and Client Coverage Development Bank of Southern Africa. I'll, again, as I go along, mention names so that we all know whom we're talking to. There seem to be no synergies, Mohan, on maybe clients like them and you when it comes to issues of what are your requirements and what are theirs. Are these some of the challenges that you think you're facing if you really want to further this job creation in trade?
Not sure. Can you hear me? I don't think this is working.
I'll give you mine in the meantime whilst we're trying to work on that one.
Yeah. So not at all. I think there's significant opportunities to finance the right type of corridor infrastructure. I think this one in particular, unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to work on, but one we're working closely with Transnet right now on, and which is one of the PIDA projects, is the LAPSAT corridor. Now, our involvement in there was because the governments of South Africa and Kenya had signed an agreement whereby the DBSA and Transnet were asked to support the Kenyan governments along with the governments of South Sudan and Ethiopia on that project. Just in the last week, there was an announcement by the Kenyan Highways Authority speaking about an agreement whereby the DBSA will be looking to provide up to $500 million of financing for the Lamu Port to Isiolo Road, which is a crucial part of the LAPSAT corridor. We've also approved $130 million of financing for the Port of Lamu, which hopefully Transnet's port operations will be operating in. It's currently being built by a Chinese entity with financing from the China Development Bank as well. So not at all. There's significant opportunities for corridor financing. Similarly, on the North-South corridor, which is one where our own president, President Zuma, is taking the lead on, there's been quite a bit of financing that we're looking at, both on the railway side, including some of the projects that Cleo spoke about. We've also provided $1 million of project preparation financing to look to see how do you improve the efficiency of that rail corridor without needing significant new CapEx, but more maintenance and investments in systems. And similarly, roads in Botswana as well. So I think there's definitely a role for external financiers like ourselves, both in the early stages through our project preparation capability, and specifically on that, we've more than doubled our annual investments in early stage, high risk project preparation, where literally 2 out of 3 of those projects never make its way through, and we write those off. But the 1 in 3 that do come through significantly lead to that bankable set of projects that, on the one hand, have significant development impact because they've been properly structured and prepared, but also create job opportunities for Africans and for African companies, obviously along with support and participation from our various international partners as well.
Okay, Mr. Sipho Khumalo, CEO, Cross Border Road Transport Agency, South Africa, which is CBRTA, sir. I think when you look at the continent, you get to see a lot of people who are doing thriving businesses, very much in the informal sector, on cross-border trade, as it were. But I just wanted to hear from you on best practices, examples of them, and success factors on how the CBRTA has increased cross-border trade.
I hope this thing is working.
That is working.
Okay.
Mine is not.
Yeah, well, firstly, let me just explain who we are and what we do.
You might take all your time in explaining who you
No,
are.
I won't take long. I just want to put things in perspective.
Yeah.
We basically a state-owned entity, and our role is to promote the linkage of South Africa with the rest of the African continent. And the part where we play a role is in respect to transport governance and creating harmonized systems in terms of how we regulate. Because the biggest thing for an operator, a transport operator, is to have conditions of predictability as you move from one country to the next. So our biggest contribution is in respect to the harmonization of transport systems. And we collaborate and partner with the neighboring countries within the SADC region. And our intention is now to move from a bilateral system where South Africa, for instance, has got bilateral agreements with a number of the neighboring countries. But what we found is that, take for instance, where you're traveling from South Africa to Zambia, it doesn't help for South Africa to have a bilateral agreement with Zimbabwe that provides for one set of circumstances but doesn't factor the third country. So we're now moving into what we call a multilateral cross-border road transport agreement. And this, for me, is the biggest contribution in terms of making sure that you create the conditions of predictability across the whole value chain and for the whole corridor. So if you take North-South corridor, for instance, you'll be traversing through a number of countries, and the idea is that this predictability should go through and should follow through. So that as an operator, if you comply with rules in one country, you know that automatically that will enable you transit to all the other countries that are linked on that specific corridor. So that's the area where we're making a contribution. But the other thing that is important for us is moving away from what we call quantity regulation to what we call quality regulation. And what we mean by that is, as opposed to regulating in terms of numbers, how many trucks or how many buses you are able, because we regulate both freight and passenger transport. We're now looking into a system of saying, let's actually regulate on the basis of a standard that we all agree to, and anyone who meets that standard has an automatic qualification, so that it's no longer a numbers game, but it's a question of standard, therefore ensuring that you can optimize the value of what flows through those corridors.
I see. Is that working? Is that have you started this inter?
It's working in bits and parts. I wouldn't say the system is up and going. We're still at a stage where we're still persuading one another as countries, and you're finding that some of the countries have actually fallen in line or have bought into the concept, but it has. I wouldn't say all of SADC has actually arrived at the destination point yet.
No, thank you. I would have wanted to put in another question, but maybe later.
All right.
On convincing people, but we want to unite. Mr. Tomohiro Seki, you are the country representative for South Africa, Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. I think following up on what Mr. Khumalo has said, maybe you could give us the Asian experience as far as corridor and trade facilitation is concerned, best practices.
I see. I don't have
Oh,
done it right. Okay. First of all, I want to apologize to be late. I just arrived from the airport, so my number of heartbeat is very high right now. Anyway, my name is Seki Tomohiro. I'm a chief representative of JICA South Africa office. JICA is Japan International Cooperation Agency. And yes, thank you for giving me to answer to your question, Chair. And yeah, regarding the case of the Asia, in Southeast Asia, the regional economic integration was little advanced in the 1980s, but it has progressed through the after is the ASEAN Free Trade Area framework of 1993 and so on. The amount of trade in the region expanded approximately 15 times from the 1980s to the first half of the 2000s. Regarding the intra-regional trade ratio, which was around 35% in the 1980s, it exceeds 50% in the first half of the 2000s. In this background, there were government-led phasing implementation of import substitution promotion policy and export industrial promotion policy. In addition, the reduction in trade costs brought by comprehensive corridor development, which Southeast Asian countries have been working on, which with support of donors, contributed to expanding trade. It can be said that the formation of value chain making full use of the advantages of technology and cost of each country in the region has led to promotion of trade within the region and development of the manufacturing industry, I think.
Well, thank you very much. We'll probably come back and ask some more questions. What I wanted to do right now is to get to the floor and get to interact with our panelists right away. So if we have roving mics, I see a hand there, and I see a hand here. Do we have roving mics? Yes, sir. Could we start from here? And then I'll come to you, sir. Yeah, let's go.
Thank you very much. I would like also to extend thanks to Mr. Daniel Makokero, whom I know for some time, for the good presentation. Of course, I have to thank the PIDA people, Professor Mayaki, African Union Commission, all the protocol observed. My question is actually with regard to the bidding of these contracts. As we know, if we try...
Sorry, Ambassador, whom are you addressing your question to?
The first ADB.
Oh, the ADB, okay.
Yes. With regard to the question of African participation in the bidding for infrastructure projects, there is one area where many of our African countries are WTO members, and the laws there is a problem to just put a paragraph in the contract that only national or African. This is a problem with legal, of course. The second thing is the capacity of technical capacity we have. I think we, apart from South Africa or maybe Egypt or few countries, many of African countries are still having lack of capacity in building big projects like bridges or dams, and I think this is it. So I suggest maybe if we can suggest an organization to make a standardization and a specification for all qualified contractors for a specific technical projects, electricity, dam, etc., that may be a good help. The other thing with regard to the 95% services that go to overseas, I think the financing of feasibility study itself is not from African countries. So maybe we need to know how much of feasibility cost is financed by African countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next question for AFDB, and then we have a question here.
Thank you very much. My question is to the panel in general, but maybe I would like to address it to the ADB representative again, because of a reference. I'm sorry, I was not very clear maybe before when I intervened. When I say the EU, the European Union, is not against public sector and transport. No, please, we acknowledge a fundamental role of private sector in terms of strategic coordination, strategic governance, prioritization and programming, and creating an effective regulatory environment. So please don't misquote me, because I think or at least I didn't want to say that. But the issue of the panel is job creation, or one of the issues. I would like my point to be on public funding for job creation. I have the feeling, but I'm addressing that to the panel, that public funding is not enough for guaranteeing job creation, and might not be the only one who can guarantee sustainable job creation. It's not enough. We quoting figures that were mentioned before. $100 billion investment required per year to cover the infrastructure gap. 400 million employments to be created in the next few years. Again, is public funding enough? That's my question. And second, might not be the only one required. We have heard a number of times bankability as a key condition for project financing. We have heard a number of times project preparation, and there is a general agreement on the need to reinforce project technical, social, environmental, economic, financial preparation, etc. Is public funding the best one to do that? I think if we don't address the scale of investment, we don't have enough jobs. If we don't address the bankability and project preparation issues adequately, we don't have sustainable jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. The question here, and then we'll go back to...
Thank you, Chair. Tabang Mamaru from Trade Invest Africa. I just want to make 3 quick interventions, just quick ones. The first one will be directed to the AFDB panelist. The second one would be to the second panelist from the left-hand side, and the third would be both to either DBSA and AFDB. With regards to infrastructure having not to be looked at as a project, but rather as an industry, how can we ring-fence the industry for African participation in light of global competition that we are currently observing? The AFDB representative indicated that a large portion of the 50 billion that is spent annually is not remaining in the continent. And that in itself becomes a major challenge. And I'm linking this, therefore, to the question to the second panelist, where he was talking about beneficiation. Because if it is that we are to talk about beneficiation, you need to understand that mining operations do not operate they do not produce to stockpile. They produce to service a contract that is already there. And in most cases, these contracts are 30-year contracts, 40-year contracts. So what advice does he have for us to change that narrative? Because for us to move to beneficiation, we have to do away with those contracts which are already in place. So if it is that we're to talk about beneficiation, how do we then change that? The third and last question would be, we have figures in every conference that we go to, that Africa requires about 93 billion on an annual basis to take care of our infrastructural needs. How much financial capacity does Africa have by itself to take care of all the infrastructural needs that we have? I thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. The 2 questions where we're coming back here were for the AFDB, and the other one I think was directed to Mohan. Sir. You still have your mic, yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Certainly very pertinent questions and very timely. I'm not quite sure about the issue of the transport with the distinguished delegate from the EU. We'll address that bilaterally. But rather than me trying to attempt to address each of these questions separately, let me just sort of put it together with some of what my distinguished colleagues in France here have said. But first, the distinguished ambassador from Sudan. The bank, I think my brother here, Emmanuel, demonstrated very well that while the African Development Bank, like any other multilateral banks, follow a competitive international bidding process, and the idea basically is simple, is to get the best services for the work to be done. But I think Namibia has demonstrated that even with those parameters, you can still build in local content and be able to take advantage of that. I think that is important because I think at the end of the day, it's not so much local content, it's the quality of the product that you produce, which is important. So I think the procurement issues can be addressed. That's the point I wanted to say. But I think you raised another very important question, which I think also is very timely, and that's that how much are the African countries themselves putting into designing these projects in such a way that they benefit the African continent more? The answer is not much. Yes, they're investing a lot, but they're not putting a lot of money into the design. Which links me to the last two questions you were asked, and I think Claire, the lady, I mean our good friend here from Transnet said it, that the projects can be economically viable, commercially. But I would say that there are three aspects, and that leads to bankability. PIDA and any other national infrastructure project has got three dimensions. One is the development impact. The second is the economic viability. The third is the commercial viability. So what have we done right and what have we done wrong? What we've not done right is that we have not packaged PIDA projects and other national infrastructure projects in a way that they are clearly distinguishable along that spectrum. Which of the PIDA projects are purely developmental? In other words, let's say rural water supply, let's say national project in that case, very important, but may not be commercially viable. We need that. Which are the PIDA projects are economic, which are commercial? That way, we'll be able to say, the developmental ones, let the public sector finance, okay? The ones which have a high economic value, let's try and forge a PPP partnership for them to be delivered. The ones with a purely commercial value, let's get the private sector to deliver, which is a question our distinguished colleague from the EU has said. What is the problem? The problem is that we have not committed sufficient resources to the preparation of projects to make them bankable and investment ready. We have lists of projects. We have, what we need is to commit enough resources, and I know a little bit about what I'm talking about there because I manage the NEPAD Infrastructure Project Preparation Facility, whose primary role is to translate PIDA projects into bankable propositions. So I can tell you now that what we need is more donor resources, more African resources into the project preparation space. I can give you the figures. Right now, the PIDA Priority Action Plan is roughly 70 billion, 68 billion. Typically, you need between 2.5 or 2% and 5% of that cost for preparation, roughly. I mean, it could be more or less. So you need anything between 2 billion and 3.5 billion to prepare the volume of projects that we have in PIDA. How much have we spent? I can tell you now that we've spent not more than 500 million, collectively, including DBSA. And that is why we don't have, and let's look at it as and by the way, let's demystify this preparation. Project preparation is just like you, Mr. Daniel, if you want to build a small storage room at the back of your house or at your farm, you need to decide what materials are you going to use? What roofing are you going to use? How much will it cost you? Will it be high or low? That's project preparation. Basically, you are taking a project, looking at the dimensions, economic, financial, and saying, will it work? How much will it cost? Now, that is the money we have not put into PIDA. Even my facility, I've been able to commit $100 million to the preparation of largely PIDA projects, but it works because of the $100 million I've committed to preparation. Our own figures show that I've been able to leverage $7.3 billion in investments, meaning every $1 that you spend on preparing a project, you're able to get back anything between $70 to $100 in terms of upstream investment financing. So I agree with the distinguished delegate there from the EU that we need to commit more resources for project preparation to have bankable investment ready projects, but we need to do more. We need to package the PIDA projects It's like a restaurant into a menu which is clear and say, this so much a potential public project. These are potential PPP projects. These are potential private projects. Lastly, can the public sector do it alone? Are the public sector funds enough, as I said? No. That's what we are saying. The public sector funds are not enough. That is why we need to package these projects more into getting more private sector involved. 93 billion per year, which is the same as the 100 billion per year, which is a study which was done by the African Development Bank together with the World Bank. How much of that is invested? Out of that, the estimates about 45 to 50 billion are actually invested. So there's a half is the funds we have, half there's a gap. Of the half that we've invested, how much is African and how much is donor? I would again say roughly half-half. About 20 billion of that could be government. Don't forget governments from their own capital budgets are able, most of the rural roads, water supply are from government's own capital budgets. So, but what we're saying is, and let's also be very careful, the figure of 100 billion, I've been involved in it, and I'm a little bit embarrassed with that figure for now, because it's been static. Huh? It's been static, which is a reflection of what we need to do with PIDA, and I'm glad that the director from AUC and Dr. Mayaki are here. PIDA itself has been static, meaning projects are being implemented. The region, the REX and other people like NAMPORT and Transnet are busy doing new projects. But we have not done a very good job of making PIDA a dynamic tool so that as new projects come in, we are able on a regular and systematic basis to update PIDA projects so that it becomes a dynamic tool so that we continue talking from the same group. Bottom line from me and from a selfish point of view, we need more donor resources, more African resources, more resources to commit to project preparation. And just so that I'm not mistaken, Chair, I'm not saying this local content, again, we must be careful. We are not saying that we ring fence the project and we do everything African. No, we are saying we need to forge strong partnerships, even with our brothers and sisters from Japan, from China, from the US, to get the best practice. But as we do that, let's domesticate, let's get more sophisticated, let's create the capacities. Like football. Football, you play with Japan and everywhere, but you have to, so the capacity is what we must create. I think we're on the right track. We just need to do more, we need to partner more, but I think we are doing the right thing. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much. Mohan.
I think on the, on the program here, it said, let's have an honest and transparent discussion as well. And so I just want to build off what my good friend Shem is speaking about on project preparation. So I think the figures that he's spoken up are absolutely correct. The 93 billion does come from 2009, so it is 8 years old. The Infrastructure Consortium for Africa, which does a really good report annually on the amount of spending that's going into infrastructure on the continent. It's available on their website. If you Google it, ICA, and it gives you a breakdown of what are the different sources, and as Shem mentioned, roughly half of that amount, the 93 billion, if you still want to use that figure, is being provided, which means that is the gap. And project preparation is crucial, but I think the bit that I want to add to is there are certain types of projects where actually the private sector will pay for the project preparations themselves. If you think about developing a mine, nobody says, give me 5% of the cost of the mine for me to go do the studies so I can then. They put that in because they feel like the return they're going to get from the mine is going to pay for that initial capex. And so if you take a look at the renewable energy program in South Africa, the DBSA provided 80 million rands at the time in 2010 to set up that program. That has led to 200 billion rands of capital investment, of which more than 90% has come from the private sector. So any amount of project preparation, if you want to call it that was put in, was actually only 80 million rands, which is what, less than 0.1% or so. So the point being, and the reason why the private sector did it was because there was a transparent and understood process for how those projects were going to be procured by the state. And because of that, they were willing to take that early stage investment. Now, the challenge we have in a lot of these PIDA projects is they're not ones that are so easily fundable through the purely private mechanism that Shem spoke about. You know, the different elements between that which has to be done by the state versus through some kind of state offtake versus those that are done purely through the private sector. And those early stage ones, they bring in a lot of risk because the private sector doesn't know, are our laws going to change? You know, is the procurement process going to change? Is a new government that comes in after 5 years, assuming you actually have free elections in the country, you know, that's going to potentially change those setups. So that is where, you know, we do need donors and we need countries themselves and DFIs like the DBSA, AFDB to put money towards project preparation. But in a lot of other cases, if you had a very transparent process and the private sector knew how they could invest in ICT, how they could invest in electricity generation, they wouldn't even need that 2.5% to 5% of the initial capex that Shem spoke about. So, you know, those kinds of early stage investments, small amounts of money in capacity building, setting up a procurement process, and which, by the way, are things that the IFC is doing with scaling solar. I know KFW is doing with Get Fit in countries like Zambia. So, you know, those are the right kinds of early stage investments as well in capacity, in procurement, which is going to lead to the tens of billions that we need in investments.
I think our time is up, but Barbara, I'll give you, yeah, please go ahead. But you have a mic.
On that point, the local ecosystem can marry job creation with local content and finance. For example, it came across my desk the other day, there was a bridge built in the UK. What were one of the principal sources of project preparation funding was the equity investment from the UK construction firm. So on the point that we're in a learning curve, we need to crowd in, as stated, in these projects. But these, let's not be mistaken, these are mega projects that require huge intellectual investment in how we structure them. And so being able to look to not only local institutional investors, but also local industries, cement, mining, whatever, that can be captive in part of the project and help fund it, we need to move in that direction. And you get job creation, local content, finance, and you get your project done.
Thank you. Squeeze it. I'll get in trouble.
I think you were concerned about beneficiation. And I think we've touched on it. We need to be specific. If you want to beneficiate and make copper piping, decide on that project. And I use Zambia as an example. Decide on the project, make it specific. Say, let's partner with China, whomever that organization or country is that does it, and have a specific sunset clause. When I mean a sunset clause, decide this is going to take 5 to 10 years to do. And then you're out. And ensure that the program is sustainable at the end of the day. Monitor it, make sure. And you take away a lot of things like your forex, your dollar risk of exporting it, being subjected to what the commodity is doing, and then importing it at that particular. You always, you know, at that particular level. You'll find that those components and so forth, and generally their components will be far more better as inputs. And that will drive one industry to the next industry. And I use Dangote as an example. They've infiltrated South Africa, where South Africa dominated in cement. And once you've dominated in that, now you can export to the same people that you were competing to, just as a point of departure.
Thank you very much. We'll have to leave it here. I'm sure lots of discussions that have been pricked by some of the points raised here. A big thank you to Barbara Samuels, who's CEO of Global Clearinghouse for Development Finance. A round of applause. A round of applause for also Cleo Sikeka, who is the GM in the CEO's office at Transnet. A round of applause for her too. Lots of very pointed points that came out of Cleo there. Clyde Oakes, Director, Barclays Africa Group Limited. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. And Emmanuel Hannibal, who is the Executive Commercial Namibia Ports Authority. And Mr. Mohan Vivekanandan, who is the Group Executive Origination and Client Coverage, Development Bank of Southern Africa.
Malo, who is the CEO of Cross Border Road Transport Agency, South Africa. And last but not least, Mr. Tomohiro Seki, who is the country representative for South Africa, Japan International Cooperation. Thank you very much. I'm sure a discussion that needs to continue, and we'll have to get to hear whether those jobs are created. We will have a 10-minute break, stretch our legs, and then we'll come back here. Thank you very much.